Harry Potter, Chapter 8. There, look! Where? Next to the tall kid with the red hair, wearing the glasses. Did you see his face? Did you see Scar? Whisper followed Harry from the moment he left his dormitory next day. People cringing outside classrooms stood on tiptoe to get a look at him, or doubled back to pass him in the corridor again, staring. Harry wished they would, because he was trying to concentrate on finding his way to classes. There were 142 staircases at Hogwarts. A wide, sweeping one, a narrow, rickety one, some that led somewhere different on Friday, some with a vanishing step halfway up that you had to remember to jump. Then there were doors that wouldn't open unless you asked politely or tickle them in exactly the right place, and a door that weren't really doored at all, but solid, while just pretending. It was also very hard to remember where anything was, because it all seemed to move around a lot. The people in the portrait kept going to visit each other, and Harry was sure the coat of armor could walk. The ghosts didn't help either. It was always a nasty shock when one of them glided suddenly through a door you were trying to open. Nearly Headless Nick was always happy to point New Gryffindor in the right direction, but Heath, the poltergeist, was worth 2 locked doors and a trick staircase. If you met him when you were late for class, he would drop a waste paper basket on your head, pull a rug under your feet, pelt you with bits of chalk, or sneak up behind you, invisible, grab your nose, and screech, "Got your conch!" Everyone worse than Pete, if that was possible, was the caretaker, Aldous Filch. Harry and Ron managed to get on the wrong side of him on the very first morning. Filch found himself trying to force their way through a door, which, unluckily, turned out to be the entrance to the out-of-bound corridor on the 3rd floor. He wouldn't believe they were lost, but sure they were trying to break it into on purpose or threatening to lock them in the dungeon when they were rescued by Professor Quirrell, who was passing. Filch owned a cat called Mrs. Norris, a scrawny, dust-colored creature with bulging, lamp-like eyes, just like Filch. She patrolled the corridor alone, break a rule in front of her, but put just one toe out of line, she would whisk off for Filch, who had appeared wheezing 2 seconds later. Filch knew the secret passageway of the school better than anyone, except perhaps the Weasley twin, and could pop up suddenly as any of the ghosts. The student all hated him, and it was all Dear's ambition of many to give Mrs. Norris a good kick. And then, once you had managed to find them, there were the lesson themselves. There were a lot more to magic, as Harry quickly found out. Then, waving your wands, saying a few funny words, they had to study the night sky through the telescope every Wednesday at midnight, and learn the name of different star and movement of the planet. 3 times a week, they went out to the greenhouse behind the castle to study herbology with a dumpy little witch called Professor Sprout, where they learned how to take care of all strange plants and fungi and found out what they were and used for. Easily, the most boring lesson was history of magic, which was the only classes taught by ghosts. Professor Binns had been very old indeed when he had fallen asleep in front of the staff room fire and got up next morning to teach, leaving his body behind him. Binns dropped on and on while they scribbled down name and date and got Emerald, the evil, and Uri, the oddball, mixed up. Professor Flitwick, the charm teacher, was a tiny little wizard who had to stand on a pile of books to see over his desk. At the start of their first lesson, he took the resistor, and when he reached Harry's name, he gave an exciting squeak and toppled out of sight. Professor McGonagall was again different. Harry had been quite right to think she wasn't a teacher to cross. Strict and clever, she gave them talking to moment they had sat down in her first classes. Transfiguration is some of the most complex and dangerous magic you'll learn at Hogwarts, she said. Anyone messing around in my class will leave and not come back. You have been warned. And she changed her desk into big and back again. They were all very impressed and couldn't wait to get started, but soon realized they weren't going to be changing the furniture into animal for a long time. After making a lot of complicated notes, they were each given a match and started trying to turn it into a needle. By the end of the lesson, only Hermione Granger had made any difference to her match. Professor McGonagall showed the class how it had done, all silver and pointy, and gave Hermione a rare smile. The class everyone had already been looking forward to was defense against dark art, but choral lesson turned out to be a bit of a joke. His classroom smelled strongly of garlic, which everyone said was too word of a vampire he had met in Romana, and he was afraid it would be coming back to get him one of these days. His turban, he told them, had been given him by an African prince as a thank you for getting rid of a troublesome zombie. But they weren't sure they believed this story. For one thing, when Samuel Fingen asked eagerly to hear how Quirrell had fought of the zombie, Quirrell went pink and started talking about the weather for another day. They had noticed that this funny smell hung around the turban, and the Weasley twin insisted that it was stuffed full of garlic as well, so that Quirrell was protected wherever he went. Harry was very relieved. He find out that he was a mile behind everyone else. Lots of people had come from Muggle family, and like him, had any idea what they were witch and wizard. There was so much to learn that even people like Ron didn't have much of a head to start. Friday was an important day for Harry and Ron. They finally managed to find their way down the Great Hall for breakfast without getting lost once. "What have we got today?" Harry asked Ron as he poured sugar on his porridge. "Double portion with Slytherin," said Ron, Snape, head of Slytherin houses. "They say he always favored them. We'll be able to see if it's true." "Wish McGonagall favored us," said Harry. Professor McGonagall was head of Gryffindor houses, but it hadn't stopped her giving them a huge pile of homework the day before. Just then the post arrived. Harry had got used to this by now, but it had given him a bit of shock on the very first morning, when about 100 owls had suddenly streamed into the Great Hall during breakfast, circling the table until they saw their owner and dropping letter and package onto their laps. Hedwig hadn't brought Harry anything so far. She sometimes flew in and nibbled his ear and have a bit of toast before going off to sleep in the owlery with the other school owl. This morning, however, she fluttered down between the marble and the sugar bowl and dropped a note on Harry's plate. Harry tore it open at once. "Dear Harry," it said, a very untidily scrawl, "I know you get Friday afternoon off, so would you like to come and have a cup of tea with me around 3? I want to hear all about your first week. Send us an answer back with Hedwig. Hagrid." Harry borrowed Ron Quill, scribbled "Yes, please, see you later" on the back of the note, and sent Hedwig off again. It was so lucky that Harry had tea with Hagrid to look forward to because the potion lesson turned out to be the worst thing that had happened to him so far. At the start of a term banquet, Harry had got the idea that Professor Snape disliked him. By the end of the first potion lesson, he knew he'd be wrong. Snape didn't dislike Harry. He hated him. Potion lesson took place down in one of the dungeons. It was colder here than up in the main castle, and would have been quite creepy enough without a pickle animal floating glass jar all around the wall. Snape, like Flitwick, started the class by taking the resistor, and like Flitwick, he paused at Harry's name. "Ah, yes," he said softly. "Harry Potter, a new celebrity." Draco Malfoy and his friend Graby and Goodly snigger behind their hand. Snape finished calling the name and looked up at once. His eyes were black like Hagrid, but they had none of Hagrid warmth. They were cold and empty, and made you think of dark tunnels. "You are here to learn the subtle science and exact air potion making," he began. He spoke in barely more than a whisper, but they caught every word like Professor McGonagall. Snape had the gift of keeping a class silent without effort. As their little foolish wand waving here, many of you will hardly believe this is magic. "I don't expect you'll be ready understanding the beauty of the softly simmering cauldron with the shimmering fumes, the the delicate power of liquid that creep through human veins, bewitching the mind, ensnaring the sense. I can teach you how to bottle fame, blue glory, even stop her death, if you aren't big as big a bunch of dunderhead as they usually have to teach. More silence followed this little speech. Harry and Ron exchanged a look with raised eyebrow. Hermione Granger was on the edge of her seat and looked desperately to start proving that she wasn't a dunderhead. Porter, said Snape suddenly, what would I get if I added powder root of Affleur to infusion of wormwood? Powder root of what to infusion of what? Harry glanced at Ron, who looked as stump as he was. Hermione's hand had shot into the air. I don't know, sir, said Harry, Snape's lips curled to sneer. Tut, fame clearly isn't everything. He ignored Hermione's hand. Let's try again, Porter. Where would you look if I told you to find me a bazaar? Hermione stretched her hand as high into the air as it would go without her leaving her seat. But Harry didn't have the faintest idea that what the bazaar was. He tried to not look at Malfoy, Graby, and Goyle, who were shaking with laughter. I don't know, sir. Thought you were an open book before coming up, Porter. Harry forced himself to keep looking straight into those closed eyes. He had looked through his book on Dursley, but did Snape expect him to remember everything in 1,000 magical herb and fungi? Snape was still ignoring Hermione's quivering hand. What is the difference, Porter, between Monchook and Wolfman? At this, Hermione stood up, her hands stretching toward the dungeon ceiling. I don't know, said Harry quietly. I think Hermione does, though why don't you try her? A few people laughed. Harry caught Simius' eye and Simius wink. Snape, however, was not pleased. Sit down, he snapped at Hermione. For your information, Porter, Affledol and Wormwood make a sleeping potion too powerful and known a draught of living death. A bazaar is a stone taken from a stomach of goat, and will save you from most potion. As for Monkshot and Wolfman, they are the same plant, which also goes by name of aconite. Well, why aren't you all copying that down? There was a sudden rummaging for quill and parchment over the noise, Snape said, and a point will be taken from Gryffindor House for their cheek, Porter. Things didn't improve for the Gryffindor as the potion lesson continued. Snape put them all into the pair and set them to mixing up for a simple potion to cure boils. He swept around his long black cloak, watching them with dried needle and crushed snake fangs, criticizing almost everyone except Malfoy, whom he seemed to like. He was just telling everyone to look at the perfect way Malfoy had stewed horned slug, when cloud of acid green smoke and loud hissing filled the dungeon. Neville had somehow managed to melt Samia's cauldron into a twisted blob, and their potion was sweeping across the stone floor, burning holes in people's shoes within a second. The whole class were standing on their stool while Neville, who had been drenched in the potion when the cauldron collapsed, mourned in pain as angry red boils sprang all over his arm and leg. Idiot boy, snarled Snape, clearing the spilled potion away as one wave of his wand. I suppose you add the portal quill before taking the cauldron of the fire. Neville whimpered as boils started to pop all over his nose. Take him up to the hospital wing. Snape spat at Simius. And then he rounded on Harry and Ron, who had been working next to Neville. You, Porter, why didn't you tell him not to add the quill? Thought he would make you look good if he got it wrong, did you? That's another point you've lost for Gryffindor. It was so unfair that Harry opened his mouth to argue, but Ron kicked him behind the cauldron. Don't push it, he muttered. After Snape can turn very nasty as he climbed the step out of dungeon. An hour later, Harry's mind was racing and his spirits were low. He had lost 2 points for Gryffindor in his very first week. Why did Snape hate him so much? Cheer him. Cheer up, said Ron, Snape always taking point off Fred and George. Can I come and meet Hagrid with you? At 5 to 3, they left the castle and made their way across the ground. Hagrid lived in a small wooden house on the edge of the forbidden forest. A crossbow and a pair of cauldrons were outside the front door. When Harry knocked there, they heard a frantic scrambling from inside and several booming bark. When Hagrid's voice rang out, saying, "Back, Fang, back!" Hagrid's big, hairy face appeared in his crack as he pulled the door open. "Hang on," he said. "Back, Fang!" He let them in, struggling to keep a hold on the collar of the enormous black boarhound. There was only one room inside. Hams and pheasant were hanging from the ceiling. A copper kettle was boiling on the open fire. In the corner stood a massive bed with a patchwork quilt over it. "Make yourself at home," said Hagrid, letting go of Fang, who bounded straight at Ron and started licking his ears. Like Hagrid, Fang was clearly not as fierce as he looked. "This is Ron," Harry told Hagrid, who was pouring boiling water in a large teapot and putting rock cake on plate. "Another Weasley, eh?" said Hagrid, glancing at Ron Freckle. "I spent half of my life chasing your twin brother away from the forest." The rock cake almost broke their teeth, but Harry and Ron pretended to be enjoying them as they told Hagrid all about their first lesson. Fang rested his head on Harry's knee and drooled all over his robe. Harry and Ron were delighted to hear Hagrid call Filch that old git, and as for that cat, Mrs. Norris, I'd like her to introduce her to Fang sometime. Do you know, every time I go up to the school, she follows me everywhere. Can't get rid of her. Filch put her up to it. Harry told Hagrid about Snape's lesson. Hagrid, like Ron, told Harry not to worry about it. That Snape liked hardly any of the students, but he seemed to really hate me. "Rubbish," said Hagrid. "Why should he?" Yet Harry couldn't help thinking that Hagrid didn't quite meet his eyes when he said that. "How's your brother Charlie?" Hagrid asked Ron. "I like him a lot. Great with animal." Harry wondered if Hagrid had changed the subject on purpose. Well, Ron told Hagrid all about Charlie, work with dragon. Harry picked up a piece of paper that was lying on the table under the tea cozy. It was cutting from the Daily Prophet. Gridgert, Brick and Lattice. Investigation continued to break in Gridgert on 31 July, widely believed to be the work of dark wizard or witch unknown. Gridgert Goblin today insisted that nothing had been taken. The vault was scorched and in fact been emptied the same day. But we're not telling you that it was not there, so keep your nose out if you know what's good for you, said Gridgert spoke Goblin this afternoon. Harry remembered Ron telling him on the train that someone had tried to rob Gridgert, but Ron hadn't mentioned the date. "Hagrid," said Harry, "the Gridgert break-in happened on my birthday. It might have been happening while we were there. There's no doubt about it." Hagrid definitely didn't meet Harry's eyes this time. He grunted and offered him another rock cake. Harry read the story again. The vault that was searched had in fact about empty early that same day. Harry had emptied vault 713. And if you could call it emptying, taking out that grubby little package, had that been the thief we're looking for? Asked Harry. As Harry and Ron walked back to the castle for dinner, their pocket whiffed down with the rock cake. They'd been too polite to refuse. Harry thought that none of the lesson he had done so far given him as much to think about as tea with Hagrid. Had Hagrid collected the package just in time? Where was it now? And did Hagrid know something about Snape that he didn't want to tell Harry?